Welcome to Ferment Radio. I am your host Aga Pokrywka, and my guest today is Maya Hay, a scholar and PhD candidate at Concordia University. Her research on fermentation and feminist theory attempts to answer questions around embodied knowledge, collective ethics, and interspecies thriving. Through chemistry labs, culinary kitchens, organic farms, and food markets, she facilitates discussions around contemporary food issues. You might already know Maya from our previous episode of Ferment Radio, when we talked about the bigger picture of fermentation as a selfless practice, and the impossibility of understanding the microbial part of ourselves. This time we continue our conversation on topics related to feminism and cultural appropriation in fermentation. Talking about, invisible, talking about changing this narration about microbes. I was just thinking that all these approaches are quite similar to what, for example, feminism is including in its philosophy, let's say. And I know that you've been using feminism alongside with fermentation in your research. I would like to hear from you a couple words, like how do you see this relationship in your particular work?
Feminism isn't only about the lived experience of females, right? It can and has been, and that's continuing to be very, very generative and wonderful. But there are plenty of feminist thinkers who push back against other kind of dominant ideas besides a man-centered world, right? So in that sense, for me, I use feminist thought to kind of question and challenge the dominant ideas about power and or assumptions, right? Because assumptions are basically power that goes unquestioned. And so, for instance, why is it that certain humans are privileged over others or other forms of life? How is it that certain knowledge or certain knowledge holders, like Louis Pasteur, for instance, are regarded as being more true than perhaps other ways of knowing? And that includes bodies too. You know, how do we continue to why is it that we continue to kind of downplay how much our bodies can know and always kind of assume that equipment and tools that measure and abstract, everything into numbers, that those are automatically going to be more true or more reliable? Or even as we were talking about this kind of vision, right? Like, why is it that certain parts of our bodies, like the eyes, continue to be more reliable and more true than other senses, right? Or even the imagination, right? And why is, for instance, the kind of background context continues to be pushed to the back as if passive, when really the environment and its conditions are actively participating in all of our human activities and all of our microbial activities, right? So these are some of the ways that I use and call upon feminist thinkers to kind of poke at that presumed power relation and go, wait, why is that? Why do we continue to believe this setup where clearly there are other ways of thinking and other ways of understanding the world? And so, like, yes, I think that there is a world, a research world where one can look at, the role of women in the kind of fermentation practices, right? That especially when it comes to the kind of gendered roles and the gendered divide of kind of domestic labor, right? That women have and continue to be the kind of the folks who are, at least on a home level, continue to kind of be the preparers of fermenting, right? That they're the ones who make the bread. They're the ones who, separate the wheat from the chaff. They're the ones who, make the cheeses and make the yogurts and make the kimchis and make the chicha. And I think that all of that is really interesting work, but I'm also interested in the kind of ideological side and the philosophical side of why do we accept certain things as being true? Why do we automatically assume that whatever Pasteur did was right and true and ethical, right? I sometimes wonder, what kind of world would we be in if Pasteur was not a white dude, right? Like, I really wonder if we would be living in the same world. So yeah, I think I'm using a lot more feminist ideas to kind of question power relations and dominant assumptions about what microbes are, what they can do, and what humans can do in relation with microbes, and just what that relationship is between humans and microbes.
What would be this relationship between humans and microbes, which would be healthier, or something we would like to globally achieve?
Certainly with regards to this kind of future is, wouldn't it be great if we continue to remain open to the idea that humans and microbes are inseparable, right? That I think so much of the narratives around control and dominance, you have to be separate from something in order to control it, right? And so I think that to already kind of approach this relationship as, no, we're in this together, we are inseparable from all kinds of microbial life, not just the good ones and not just the bad ones. Like, we are always tangled up and we're threaded through each other, always. Like, to start from that point is, I think, a very challenging but also very promising future, right? Because it changes the way that we approach health. It'll change the way that we think about, how we live on this planet together. I think if we continue to think of these ideas of inseparability and being threaded through each other, and that's hard to think about too, not just because they're invisible, but because of their size. We so want to assume that, well, just because we're bigger, that they're inside us and we're the ones on the outside. But no, we're covered in them. Like, every single surface, our skins and everything. So once we understand that we are all in this together, and by all, I mean all beings, all sizes, all colors, all, histories, all terrains, then we can really start to shift, perhaps how we think about our own power. And not just that I am an individual capable of, I am an agent of change, but perhaps how can we create a shared environment that's conducive to us both, and or that's conducive to all of us, right? And this is also like the sticky part of it, of the whole, like, we are all one business, right? The sticky part of that, and this is crucial, is that certain species and certain folks, certain beings, certain individuals are way more vulnerable than others, and or way more marginalized than others, way more oppressed, right? And so this blanket approach of, well, we are all one, is a bit of a flattening thing. It kind of erases those vulnerabilities. It erases those marginalizations. It erases those histories of oppression, right? And so this is why, for instance, the all lives matter rhetoric doesn't work, right? And that, right, like, we have to be very specific about how we create change and how we attend to those who are vulnerable, those who have been marginalized, and those who have historically been oppressed and exploited, right? And so it's kind of, that's a very complex idea to have, because it sounds very paradoxical. But I think that if we really grapple with that seemingly contradictory idea, I actually think that there's tremendous amount of hope. And this is where, for me at least, especially right now, maybe with so much dread and doom in the world, I really want to hold on to that hope that we will continue to be, paying attention and being grounded and specific and putting concerted efforts into the relationships, especially towards vulnerable populations, marginalized populations, right? That I would hope, that is really where my hope is for not just fermentation. Fermentation is, I think, one way to get into it. But on a lighthearted note, like, I really wonder, I would be really interested to know, of the people who consider themselves, fermenters, I'd be really curious to know what percentage consider themselves like conservative, like politically. I would be very curious because, this goes back to your question too, right? About, is this something that is innate or is this something learned, about being able to kind of tune in to these other needs? And, I really wonder, because if it is the case that fermenters around the world historically have leaned more towards progressive and radical ideas, well then there's your answer, right? Like, we can ferment our way out of this, right? And it's not easy. Certainly not easy. And I'm sure you have your own botched batches, but I certainly have my whole, a whole slew of botched experiments and attempts at fermenting. And I think that there's something to be said too about maybe what we call, microbial rot can be applied to society as well. Like, maybe we are rotten right now, and in order to fix that rot and come out of it, we need to actively ferment a society towards a shared hope.
Since we are talking about this, power structures and so on, and we are talking about people who are fermenting and who they are, I'm quite intensively working with fermentation for like last 6 years, let's say. And I don't know if it's long or short, but I've been observing, following people who are doing it for that amount of time. And through this time, I noticed that this interest is predominantly white. I wonder if I don't have access to populations who are also having similar interests because I'm in my bubble and it's hard for me to see through, or it's again something which is just, dominated by the dominant. Maybe there is something not working. And yeah, it's something which I think I am still not able to phrase well, but it kind of started to bother me.
Yeah. Oh, I hear you. I probably in the same way. I have a paper that I've been sitting on for the last maybe 2.5, almost 3 years, because I still can't put words to it. But I'm trying to describe exactly what you've just shared, and that because there is now the element of choice, right? That one can choose to ferment, that we've erased the need, right? Like the survival need of fermenting, right? Because we're in a contemporary food system or food regime. But by making it such a choice, it's almost become this sort of the same kinds of problematics as like exotic or ethnic cuisines, right? That, oh, I'm going to make kimchi now because it's like eating tacos, right? This idea that specifically the idea of a white food colonizer or food adventurer. That's a word that one of my favorite philosophers, her name is Lisa Heldke, she coined that term. Food adventurers tend to be white and food colonizers. That they can go about making kimchi and call it theirs, right? And that then, is that problematic? Yeah, kind of, right? And it really depends on how much the person is engaging with more than just the surface level recipe and then claiming ownership of it, right? So are they engaging with the history? Are they engaging with the culture? Are they engaging, are they magnifying the voices of the people that they're learning it from? And really, if they're trying to magnify the voices of the people that they're learning this from, is the white person really the best person to be talking about how great kimchi is? Maybe not, right? And so this is where like things are beyond sticky. It's actually kind of wrong, but we just don't know how to call out that wrong yet. Beyond like terms of exoticizing and claiming ownership and authentic, claiming ownership over others' ideas and others' food rituals. There's something about exacerbating the myth of classlessness by saying I can, choose to ferment versus fermenting out of necessity. There's this whole, especially when you throw gender into the mix, that the whose knowledge is being represented by whom, right? Is the white dude chef claiming knowledge of, for instance, gendered practices and or indigenous or endogenous knowledge from elsewhere, and then calling it theirs, and then they're getting all the credit, they're getting all the customers in the restaurants, but then there's no remuneration or acknowledgement of where this knowledge came from, right? Those are layers of problematic things. We just don't know how to point at it and call it out yet. We're pretty good at cultural appropriation, I think, when it comes to like fashion or music, and to a certain extent food, but ferments, we've just not really gotten there yet. I think we're about to, and I'd certainly be the first one to sit down with popcorn and watch it all unfold. And I may even participate, but I am very looking forward to that conversation.
And you've mentioned the article which you are writing, and is it exactly about like this kind of issues, or it's a part of it?
Yeah, it's so the reason why I've stopped writing it is because so much has happened since I started writing. I don't know if you remember, but like 2 years, 3 years ago, um, there was something floating around on social media about. Do you know the show It's Alive? It's an online show run by Bon Appetit with Brad. I don't remember his name, but he's like a Bon Appetit character, and he goes around and makes all of these different ferments, and like woo, and like there's this kind of charm, white dude charm around it, of like he can just do whatever and it'll just happen, and la and um I'm sure it's comical, but there was also a woman, I believe her name was Jenny Yang, who filmed two sets of mothers and daughters. So like a mother-daughter like dyad. She would film them watching the Brad episode making kimchi. And the mothers and daughters would look at each other and they would just like comment on like, like that's not what we would do when we would make kimchi. You're like, oh, I wonder why he did that, right? And there's this like whole running commentary in the back. And, some of it is also just clarification of like, well, this is actually an ingredient pronounced this way, and we use it this way because of this, right? So there's like explanation and very like educational for sure. And there's like some, comedic moments of like mom is laughing hysterically. She's like, why is he doing that? But like they never call him out. They never say, that's not kimchi, right? And so what's interesting is that from at least the Korean mothers and daughters, there's this understanding that, well, we make kimchi and what he made is also maybe called kimchi, but we're not considering it the same thing, right? They're actually two separate things. And so the reason why I stopped writing was because since then, I don't know how much you've been following the different kind of shifts in food politics and specifically food journalism, but the head of Condé Nast and Bon Appetit have both been removed for saying and believing and being vocal about quite misogynistic and racist things. I believe actually they just nominated or just replaced the directorship under a different woman, and so I was what started out as just like looking at this tiny little microcosm of Brad and kimchi, and I kind of spiraled out into this much greater issue with not just Bon Appetit, but also their parent company Condé Nast, and their views clearly being essentialist and being reductionist and racist and misogynistic. And so I've been kind of holding off on letting that dust settle before I actually look at the argument in whole, because I actually think that there's something there, right? So all to say, I'm not sure if the timing will work out, but I would love to continue working on that idea, because I agree with you. There is absolutely problematic layers to it, and that's not to say nobody should ever learn any ferment ever again. No, but I think that if we are going to, extract knowledge from other people, that we find more meaningful relationships and ways of keeping and maintaining those relationships, whether that is in the form of acknowledgement or remuneration, or, that we're treating this beyond knowledge exchange, or certainly not a one-way exchange, right? That we think further about how do we want to ethically keep spreading this knowledge, and not hoard and only think of oneself.
Yeah, I also think that it's about like building communities also, because I would say that, the community of people who are interested in fermentation is kind of formed. Since fermentation, it's global. Dishes which are fermented are in most of the cultures. So why those people are not taking part in this discussion about fermentation? And this worries me.
Yeah. And, I think that there's something to be said too about generations, right? And especially because in a place like the US, right, or even Canada, that, first generation folk who arrive to places like North America probably brought with them some sort of starter culture of some sort, right? Because at least back then, there was still like the fear of food insecurity, right? And fermentation's number one, role was forever to be a way of preserving nutrients, right? And so whether that is like, I'm sure there are, and the stories escape me now, but there's examples of like people, drying yogurt and putting it in a bag, or, taking their sourdough starters with them. Green Revolution in the 60s was all about like, we're not going to have enough food for the world population, which was a total lie. But it worked because it really set in motion a lot of the food system, like a lot of what we have in the food system today, right? So in terms of like monocrops, in terms of like the technical demands and the equipment demands, and so, and like the industrial production and all of that. And so I wonder, to what extent first generation folk pass down that knowledge, and that there's also shame, right? And there's shame and guilt, especially around like assimilating and being othered, right? Like how many stories of like being shamed and othered as a kid because you ate a ferment that smelled bad, and you could, like the kids on the playground could smell it on your clothes and whatnot, right? Like, or something coming out of your lunchbox, or friends coming over to your house and it smells a certain way because of the ferments. Like there's so much stigma around. There was and continues to be a lot of stigma around the fermentation experience as well, that I wonder to what extent second generation, third generation folk have kind of taken up those fermentation practices, right? Because there's no longer a necessity for it, because we can just waltz to the store and buy a booch and buy, yogurts that have bacteria added to it, right? Or we can buy butter that says raw and cultured or whatever, right? We can do all of these things now. So yeah, I'd be curious to know where or how that knowledge got interrupted historically, and also generationally, and then also geographically. And that would be not just a dissertation. That sounds like a big data nightmare that I would love to look at, and I would not want to be the one leading that project.
Yeah, I share that.
Sounds like a nightmare. I don't know if I could.
That was Maya Hay. You can follow her on Instagram at HeyMayaHey, and her website is heymayahay.com. If you would like to know more about the show, listen to this episode again, or find previous episodes, please go to fermentradio.com. You can subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and more. Ferment Radio is supported by Culture of Cultures and produced by Super Eclectic. Thank you for listening, and stay tuned for the next episode of Ferment Radio.